This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Flare, a leader in providing actionable cyber threat intelligence to companies and governments around the world.
Imagine a world before the internet as we know it. No Google, no Instagram, no YouTube. That's when Marc Andreessen began tinkering with computers. In 1992, Marc co-created Mosaic, the first web browser with a graphical user interface. Marc then co-founded Netscape in 1994, challenging Microsoft in the nascent browser market. Netscape went on to become the dominant browser of the mid-90s. In 2009, he co-founded Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm that has become a powerhouse in the tech world, identifying and investing in groundbreaking companies like Facebook, Airbnb, GitHub, and Slack. But Marc's influence goes beyond the realm of technology. He's a sought-after commentator, a prolific writer, and a vocal advocate for innovation and disruption. His blog, Wall Street Oasis, offers commentary on the tech industry and the future of society. He's also a leading thinker on the intersection of technology and national security issues. We'll be right back with a thought-provoking interview with Marc Andreessen. But first, here's my colleague Michael Morrell with a message about Flare.
The lines between geopolitical risk and cyber risk are blurring. Flare is a next-generation, continuous threat exposure management SaaS platform that equips corporate information security teams with world-class collection and continuous monitoring across dark web cybercrime forums, markets, Telegram channels, and sources of geopolitical risk. Flare sets up in 30 minutes, creates actionable intelligence from hour one, and is used by governments, security teams, and threat intelligence teams around the world. You can try Flare's free trial at their website, flare.io. That's flare.io.
Welcome back. Marc, great to have you on the podcast. I heard someone say about you that the internet practically owes you rent. And so, from Mosaic to Netscape, you really helped build the on-ramps to the digital highway. And now you're helping other tech business pioneers. So for our listeners that are not familiar with Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z and the vernacular, can you tell us about your venture firm?
Yeah, so my partner, Ben and I, we both started out as engineers. We have engineering training backgrounds, college degrees. We both worked in tech companies, founded tech companies. And then, we built products. And then over time, we became, business people. And we actually started our own startups and started running companies. And then in 2009, we sort of switched sides, if you will, and we became venture capitalists. And basically what that means is we're an investment firm. We raise money from institutions like endowments and foundations, and then we invest money in new tech startups. And it's a kind of very active way of investing. We spend a huge amount of time scouting the landscape, meeting with thousands of entrepreneurs a year across every different sector of new technology. We typically take a significant, never a majority stake, but a significant stake in the companies we invest in. These are private companies, so this is something where if the companies work, they're a decade away from being liquid in a way that we would actually kind of directly make money. So it's very long-term investing, and then we become very actively involved. And so we typically go on the board and we kind of become a key advisor to the company and kind of help the next generation of entrepreneurs build the next generation of tech companies.
Yeah, so Marc, I guess I haven't asked you this before, but in a year, how many companies, ballpark, do you look at?
Yeah, so you're going to see, and we operate across a bunch of sectors in tech, but I would sort of ballpark it as probably 5,000. And those are, to give you a sense of that, those are qualified referrals or introductions, and so which is to say they're either people we already know or they're people who are being introduced to us by people we already know. And so it's 5,000 like high quality opportunities with people where you could believe that they have a credible claim to be able to start a successful tech company. And so obviously, there's a lot more, so-called cold inbound that's sort of outside that. And so, this is 5,000. And one way to look at that is 5,000 is, it's a lot, for we're not that big of a firm. So it's a lot of people to meet with, and a lot of ideas to explore. Look, on the other hand, it's not that many. The global the global population is 8 billion people. 5,000 teams a year. Starting what we consider to be credible tech companies. It's not that many people. So it's still a very fringe niche, kind of specialized thing that all these founders are trying to do, and we try to see as many of them as we can.
And even if you look at 5,000, you're investing in a really small fraction of that, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, something like, typically 1% to 2% of sort of new fresh investments per year out of that group, depending on how you count. And so the sort of dark humor joke is that our day job is crushing entrepreneurs' hopes and dreams. We say no, far more often than we say yes. We try to be very, of course, we try to be honest as we can with people as to why we're saying no to help them improve. And by the way, it's not that unusual that we say no the first time we meet somebody and then we change our mind. A year or 2 or 3 will pass and they'll improve what they're doing and they'll figure out, they'll take feedback and they'll figure out a better way to do things. And it's not unusual that we come back later and invest. It's actually very rare that we invest in the first meeting. It's almost always a year or 2 later when we invest. And so it's a collaborative process. Frankly, even when we're not invested, it's a collaborative process where we're kind of talking with them, we're arguing with them, we're trying to help them a lot of the time. They're trying to educate us. And you look, every entrepreneur is doing something brand new. Like if they have a chance of success, it's because they're doing something brand new. And anybody trying to do anything brand new, whether it's start a company or, write a book or anything, right? They're operating in the unknown, right? They don't know what all the answers are, because if anybody knew what all the answers were, the thing would have already been done. And so they're journeying through the fog. And we're basically, when we invest, we're signing up to journey with them through the fog. And so it's actually a very collaborative process to try to work with them and try to help them do that.
So, Mark, you're in Washington for the second annual American Dynamism conference. And so could you tell us a little bit about what that is and why you think the investments it makes are so important for national security?
Yeah, so the history of the U.S. tech industry historically was very intertwined with the federal government. If you go all the way back to like the 1910s, 1920s, which is when sort of the modern federal government appeared and the modern military appeared in the way that we understand it today, it was during what was called the Second Industrial Revolution, and so that was the rise of airplanes. Tom Hanks has this great new series coming out on Apple TV that looks just spectacular about the early airplane, early aerial combat, the early American combat aviators. So there was like early aerospace work. There was early work in everything from, missiles, guidance systems, radar. Actually, a lot of that work actually happened in Silicon Valley, not far from where we sit in the 1920s, 1930s. The U.S. government was very, obviously intertwined with all that, funded a lot of that. That was the seedbed that ultimately became Silicon Valley. The people who worked on those systems later on, and ended up starting a lot of the best new tech companies in the 40s, 50s. And then, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, DOD and DARPA and the intelligence agencies and the National Science Foundation, were very involved in seeding a lot of the technologies that became, the computer industry and the biotech industry. And then, of course, the modern kind of post-World War II American military and intelligence machine has been fueled by technology, and a lot of that technology has come from American tech companies. And I think for a very long time that was a very productive, relationship, in that the government really actively supported and worked with the tech industry, and then the tech industry both provided technologies essential to national security, but also, built up America's economic strength, right? Because the American tech industry, being globally dominant, has been, I think, enormously to the U.S.'s interests, both, economically and in terms of national security. I think in the last 30 years or 40 years, I think that relationship has really, degraded or collapsed in pretty profound ways. And, honestly, a lot of that is probably the fault of those of us in the tech industry. And we could talk about that. But, also I think over time, DC and Silicon Valley are just, they're 3,000 miles apart. It's hard to maintain the relationships. There's lots of things that changed in DC also that I think made the relationship worse. And I think it's just become clear to like a new generation of entrepreneurs and to at least some policymakers that I think it's important to rebuild that relationship. And so our contribution to that is to we have this program called American Dynamism, and it's basically to try to find a new generation of founders who are building companies that are directly relevant to the government, or directly relevant to sort of civil society, either the things the government does or things the government should be doing, right? Or maybe could be doing better. We have some very patriotic young founders who think that this is, an absolutely great idea. It's one of the things you see in the Valley is a new generation of startups where they're literally flying giant American flags, which is something that had gone out of fashion for a while out here. or out in the Valley. And so, some very enthusiastic young founders doing that. And then, we have, challenges in DC, but we certainly have some enlightened people who really want to see this happen. And so this program is intended to try to catalyze this kind of return to a very strong relationship between the two worlds.
So, Mark, I just want to get to something that you said here a moment ago, and we've known each other for a few years now, but one of the early discussions that you and I had was about an article that Amy Ziegert wrote for The Atlantic on the divide between Washington and Silicon Valley. And, at times it's been particularly acute, as you've sort of referred to, especially on national security matters, even though, as you said earlier on, that, the Valley early growth was fueled by, defense investment. So Amy wrote that article in 2018, I believe. So have things gotten better or worse? And what's required to make it better if things have not just improved?
Yeah, I would say better in some ways, worse in other ways. And of course, it's important to say the technology industry is not a monolith, and so we have people with very different views in our world. And then of course the government, everybody who deals with the government wishes it was a monolith, but it's not. And so there are different agencies, different people, different agendas. Look, the federal government, the federal government in some ways is the tech industry's best friend. I would say there's more cooperation happening right now on things like, for example, next generation warfare. There are, companies, that are now, new tech companies that are now very successful. I think really helping the Department of Defense, with kind of a new generation of warfare technologies, defense technologies, intelligence technologies. And so some of that's working well. And then, U.S. tech companies traditionally are big multinational companies. Like we succeed internationally. Every new Silicon Valley startup we back wants to be a global company. The U.S. government has at times been very good partners to help, make sure that foreign markets are actually open for access and that, there's a level playing field and so forth. And so, because different other countries are not necessarily, that thrilled about American technological dominance. And so they try to kneecap our companies, and the U.S. government will go to bat, for us in a pretty reasonable number of times on that. And so some of those things are working very well. And then, look against that, there are a significant number of people and frankly agencies, I would say more on the civilian side, in Washington, where they just have staked out a very sort of strident anti-tech position. And this comes up in, financial services a lot. This comes up in biotech a lot. This comes up in the crypto landscape, in an enormous way. Sort of institutional Washington is very much kind of at war with what the Silicon Valley crypto and Web3 entrepreneurs are trying to do. And then look, even in defense, the defense procurement, world is wired for incumbents. And there have been these cases where, SpaceX legendarily had to actually sue its way into business, for it to get federal, defense contracts, because the procurement system in DoD is still so wired for the big incumbents. And so even when you end up being best friends, a lot of the time there's contention to get there. And so, I would say, look, it's a mixed bag. Like I said, look, honestly, a lot of this I put on Silicon Valley. It's a lot of things in the world have become politicized. A lot of things in Silicon Valley have become politicized. There was a big push. There was like this moralistic push among a lot of new companies, I would say in the 2000s and 2010s, to very deliberately not work with the government and even try to oppose the government. There was a famous blow up at Google, where they had this program working with DoD on this drone thing, and there was an employee revolt and a sort of a mob thing, and the company capitulated to the mob, and and so the Valley has done a bunch of things to generate mistrust, I think, and so I think we've been our own worst enemy in some ways, but. Look, correspondingly, there are some people in Washington that are just very hostile to American tech, and they're very hostile to American, technological, excellence, supremacy, global supremacy. They have various political motivations, various institutional motivations. I wish they wouldn't do it. They don't. A lot of them, for the people I'm describing, I won't name names, but they won't even meet with us. And so they've just staked out this very kind of hostile position. And I certainly hope over time that the sort of more sober and prudent people, in Washington kind of over time realize how irresponsible that is.
So, Mark, as we think about some of the pressing, national security concerns broadly, tell me what you think about how does the rapid sort of development of things like AI and cybersecurity, robotics, advancements in space, how do you see that sort of challenging, U.S. dominance, U.S. national security concerns?
Yeah, so the basic framework, the way I think about it is, look, the computer industry used to be a world of mainframes, right? And so you'd have these giant, computers that everybody's always seen in movies and TV shows that fill up entire rooms and have, sort of men in lab coats, kind of a high priesthood of like technical experts taking care of them. And, there are these kind of very special things that cost, a huge amount of money.
Mark, that was when I was in college. You had to go to a room to use the computer. You give your cards to somebody sat behind a desk, and it was all very daunting.
Exactly, and by the way, me too. In fact, where I went to college, actually, there was a famous case. There was we had a supercomputer that our campus bought, and it was so big that actually a building actually got built specifically for that computer. And the computer was so big that the building got built. They left the roof unfinished, and they lowered the computer in through a crane through the roof. Right, and so yeah, exactly right. And so what am I describing? I'm describing the computer industry circa 1980. And then I'm describing, the military circuit today, right? Aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, $200 million, fighter jets, B-2 bombers, military satellites, submarines. We lived in a world in which technological systems used for civilian use and also warfare and intelligence were just these very large, complicated top-down systems where you had a small number of very large assets. Look, and then the computer industry is like completely transformed. And now today, like that, those things still exist, but they're they're a tiny fraction of the things that matter. The things that matter now are the things that go in your pocket, right? So it's a smartphone, and it's all the, it's your laptop, and it's your earpiece, right? And your smart glasses in the future. And then it's software, right? It's things that aren't even tangible. It's AI, and now with AI, it's things that talk to you. It's, speech interaction. And all these sort of advanced displays, just like all these new AI technologies. And so there's just a new generation of technology, and the new generation of technology is bottoms up, right? It's bottoms up. It's these markets. The computer industry has switched to being consumer led. In the old days, the DoD would buy a new computer first, and then big business, and then small business, and then 30 years later, a consumer would buy a version of it. And now, the new technologies are almost all consumer driven. AI, for example, is consumer driven. Chat GPT is the most sophisticated AI on the planet today, and you just sign up and use it for $20 a month, right? And 100 million people do that, years in advance of when most businesses are going to figure out how to use it. And so the new technologies are software-based. They are small. They are intangible. They are very flexible. They are very powerful, and they just render a lot of the old systems obsolete, right? And then you just see this directly on the battlefield. Oh, you see this right now with what's happening with the Suez Canal area, right? You've got a $20,000 drone being shot out of the sky with a $20 million missile, right? Like it's you have this new asymmetry, or you have the situation on the Ukraine battlefield where you'll have a Soviet main battle tank, that gets taken out by a shoulder launched missile, right? You just have this like 1,000 to 1 or 10,000 to 1, discrepancy in the cost of these assets. It just seems, I think, pretty clear. I think most sophisticated thinkers in military affairs basically say, look, the future is going to be these sort of decentralized, these sort of large scale but like decentralized systems with much larger numbers of smaller units. Giant swarms of drones, or giant constellations of small satellites, and then just tremendous amounts of software. And so the good news is, look, there's a really significant opportunity to advance national security by doing this. You can have much more intelligent systems. They can they can understand much better what's happening on the modern battlefield. They can analyze a lot more information. You have more autonomous, things, that are in the air, on the ground, and then underwater that can go prosecute, military, agendas without putting human soldiers at risk. You can have, strikes on specific targets with much less collateral damage, right? So there's like really profound opportunities for improvement, and reduction of civilian, fatalities and all, friendly fire and all the other sort of, horrors of war, by doing this. But it's a revolution in technology that's driving this. And so the good news is that everything I just described is a technology revolution that's happening in the industrial consumer, kind of sector of technology on the civilian side. And then it's just a question of sort of how quickly and, correctly, of course, can we map that into defense and intelligence. And that it is happening. And frankly, I think it should and can happen much faster from here.
So, Art, given these descriptions, can the U.S. effectively maintain a technological edge in this increasingly global technological landscape?
If we want to, I think that's a choice. Look, we're the presumptive winner. I also put it this way: is we're the presumptive winner. In a lot of ways, by the way, I think our problem is that we're the presumptive winner. I think like our enemies in D.C. When I basically ask them, the people who really don't like us, I'm like, well, don't you worry about the U.S. not being technologically dominant? Their answer is not so much that no, they don't worry about it. It's just that they assume it's always going to be the case no matter what, right? And so that they can just kind of they can hate us and punish us and abuse us as much as they want, and it doesn't matter because we're gonna win globally anyway. And I try to educate them that maybe that's not the case, but look, even they would agree that we're the presumptive winner, and the reason is just the historical strengths of the U.S. in technology are so strong, right? The dynamism of the U.S. economy, our immigration policies, bringing the best and brightest engineers from all over the world here, our research universities, our tech companies, are globally dominant. I mean, look, we have single companies. I think this is the case today. I think Apple's market capitalization is equal to or greater than the entire German stock market, right? So we have this giant head start where, and AI, you see the same thing, by the way. Like we're just light years ahead on AI. Like almost all of the interesting work happening in AI is happening in the U.S. Almost all of that, by the way, is happening in California. So despite all of our challenges, we just have this massive lead. But history. Like over the scope of history, there have been many empires that have had massive leads, including massive technological leads, and then they just decide at some point to give it up, right? And it's why is that? Is it's historically you look at it and you're like, well, they became complacent. They became rested on their laurels. Their sort of incumbent interest got entrenched. A power structure got put in place where change was no longer allowed. Or frankly, they became self-loathing. They decided that they were that they were immoral, and they decided that they were actually incorrect, and they basically just capitulated to the forces of history. And so the story of the long-term story of history is turnover of dominant empires and dominant civilizations, with big scientific and technological leads that just decided to give it up. And so I certainly hope that's not us.
So given that we're talking about Washington here, it does lead us to this question about what's the role of the U.S. government and what role should it play in critical emerging technologies, especially those that have serious national security dimensions. I know you have views here, so what do you think here?
Yeah, so everybody probably saw this movie Oppenheimer that came out this summer, which was a very kind of vivid recreation of what the model that you're describing, sort of 70, 80 years ago, where you've got a major new technology like nuclear physics, and so what do? Is you appoint an army general, who recruits a leading scientist, who basically just basically Shanghai's the sort of leading physicists of that era, into basically a military project, run by DoD, and they developed the atomic bomb. You always wonder, like in an existential situation, like another World War II, if that had to happen, would that happen again? And if it was like truly a World War II level, conflict situation like that with a breakthrough technology like that, you could maybe imagine that world coming back and somebody trying that again. In practice in the last 50 years, that's not how things have been done. That just isn't how things have happened. Most significant advances in military or intelligence technology have not happened that way. They've happened with collaboration with the private sector, right? And so they've happened with the government having an enlightened and productive, two-way relationship with the private sector. The government being, I think, over, especially kind of from the 50s through the 80s, as I trace the history, kind of having a very, I would say, sophisticated view of basically leveraging the flexibility and dynamism of the private sector and leveraging private market incentives. And so, for example, the government maybe as a funder of early R&D, and the government as a major initial customer of new technologies, but fundamentally, technologies being developed by people working for private companies, and then those private companies actually having commercial businesses and raising equity capital and raising debt capital from private markets. Right. And so the point of that being like a productive of two-way relationship between the two best parts of the American system, which is a strong government and a strong private sector. And that's just a very different, dynamic than existed, in the Oppenheimer era. It's also a very different dynamic that exists in China today, right? Where, they sort of have private companies, but not really, because those companies are ultimately owned and controlled by the Communist Party, and the Communist Party, has direct ability to tell them what to do. And you see, this clampdown happening in China right now, where the government's basically taking control of them. So I would like to think that we can have this best of both worlds, private-public partnership, model with an enlightened approach, where people on both sides kind of understand the advantage of bringing these two worlds together. Like I said, it's working in some areas. It's breaking down in other areas. There's a bunch of things. Like one of the things is, everything has gotten politicized. And so, this gets into partisan politics very quickly, but there are people in Washington who are kind of very mad at the tech industry for what I think are political reasons. And so that ends up really hurting things. Look, the other thing is incumbents play a role here, right? And there are these, there are very large, entrenched, private companies or kind of quasi-private companies that have been somewhat nationalized over time, and they very much do not want startups to succeed, and so they have very powerful lobbying capabilities, and so they go into Washington with an argument that these startups are a threat, not an opportunity. And so I think that it's just, I don't know. It's very clear to me that it's just like there's a chocolate and peanut butter kind of thing here that really ought to work really well. And there are lots of examples of it working, and we should do a lot more of that.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Marc Andreessen.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So is there, as you think about some of these technologies, Mark, just pick a couple. Let's look at, just think about biotech and AI. Both can make the world much better, but there's also a dark side to certainly to each of them. Is there a role for the U.S. government? I realize that trying to regulate is probably not the approach, but at least put guide rails on, or did you just see that as setting us up to fail?
Yeah, so I sort of there's two totally different discussions on that topic. And of course, this is a very hot topic right now with AI in particular. There's two very different discussions that I have with people in Washington. And what's interesting is I have the two very different discussions often with the same people. So on Tuesday, I'll talk to, a senior policymaker, and they'll be like, basically this AI thing or this biotech thing, to your point, is like a huge threat. And we need to make sure that the government comes in and regulates and prevents bad things from happening. And then on Thursday, I'll have a very different conversation, which is China is also doing this thing. And it is extremely important that America and American tech companies and American tech innovators win the global race to dominance in this new technology. Because if China wins in AI or China wins in biotech, that's an enormous problem and threat to the United States. And so what can the government do to help make sure that American industry actually wins and succeeds? And of course, these are actually in substance diametrically opposed conversations, right? Because are you trying to handcuff us or are you trying to unleash us, right? Now, having said that, there is nuance, right, that you could get into. The productive conversation comes with kind of the resolving the dialectic and getting into the synthesis. Like, the nuance in it, I think, would be as follows, which is like, okay, how do we have American technological dominance, right? How do we make sure that that it's us and not China? Of course, there are downsides to any new technology. Of course, there are potential dangers. Technologies are tools and they can get used for good and bad things. And so, kind of what's the smart form of the regulation that we can have domestically inside the U.S. to make sure that the really bad things don't happen. And by the way that we talk about that in substance is basically say regulate the use as opposed to regulate the technology, right? And so if a technology can be used to commit fraud, or if a technology could be used potentially to harm somebody, physically harm somebody, kill somebody, facilitate a terrorist attack or something like that. Look, fraud is illegal, terrorist attacks are illegal, assault and murder are illegal, right? And so figure out how to basically use the regulations and laws that we have against bad people doing bad things, and then make sure that the people responsible for preventing and punishing those crimes and deterring those crimes are able to fully understand these new technologies and how to make sure that they offset that. But look, the other thing is building defenses, right? And so, and here you go right back to the China thing, which is China is going to use AI offensively, and China is going to use biotech offensively, right? And so we live in a world in which we have to imagine, let's take biotech for example, we have to imagine that our enemies are going to use advanced biotech to build new kinds of biological weapons. And so, for example, like from a technological standpoint, could a hostile regime build a biotech weapon that does, targeted assassination bugs, right? That like key onto, you could imagine creating a virus that basically targets a specific individual's DNA. You release it in some city somewhere in the world, and then it basically travels and it's harmless for everybody. But it lands and it kills the president because somebody got a hold of the president's DNA. And so it's like, okay, that would be China using biotech or some other hostile actor using biotech in a way that's fundamentally threatening. What's the logical response to that? Is to actually use American technological ingenuity to build the defenses to that, right? And so how do you, for example, use advanced biotech on the American side? And by the way, how do you use like AI to help design, these defenses to be able to build like, basically full spectrum vaccines that would render, attacks like that completely harmless? Just because you have just a much better set of defenses. Or how do you use AI to build much stronger cyber defenses? And so I think there's this like defensive conversation, like how to harness the power of these technologies to build stronger defenses. That is ultimately the important conversation. There's shades here of what President Reagan tried to do with Star Wars, with SDI, right? Like, ultimately, how do you deal with, threats from, military attack is you build defenses. There's a lot more that we could be doing to build sophisticated defenses. And I think that would be a much more productive way to spend our time than trying to figure out how to kneecap ourselves.
So this is really interesting, Mark. And we were talking about, basically technological disruption, I guess, if you will, and the challenges that it could present to national security. So, and maybe your answer is the defense one you just talked about, but are these technological disruptions, are they just going to be black swans that we have to quickly adapt to, or do you think there are ways to get ahead of them and anticipate them so that it's not this, fire drill that would occur?
Yeah, so look, I think you ought to be able to anticipate these. So William Gibson, who wrote one of the great science fiction novels called Neuromancer that predicted a lot of what's happening today, he has this famous line saying that he says, the future is already here, it's just not fully distributed yet. Which is to say that like basically almost everything that is going to be important technologically in 20 or 30 or 40 years is already running in a research lab somewhere today, right? And almost certainly that's, by the way, an American research lab. And by the way, probably that's at one of the top universities, or it's at one of the top tech companies, or it's one of our startups. Right, like, right, and why am I confident in saying that is because everything that's important technologically today was running in a research lab 40 years ago. Right. And in fact, to your point, like the government actually funded a lot of it. I mean, the U.S. government started funding AI research in the 1940s. Right. Like AI is not a surprise. Like there was an 80-year R&D effort to get to where we got to. Right. And then biotech, the U.S. government started funding biotech in like the 1950s. Right. And so there's been, 60 years of development to get to the point where you could have the kind of virus that I'm talking about, or the kind of defense that I'm talking about. So no, I think there's a long lead time on these things. In practice in our world, almost everything we see that works, it's almost always, we call it the overnight success with a 40-year backstory. Like it's almost always that you had decades of people trying to get these things to work before they actually worked. I actually think you can think ahead in a lot of these things. And again, this goes to, unproductive versus productive conversations. Easily it would be, I think, a good idea, a no-brainer to have a lot more time in the sort of overlap in the two worlds, of DC and Silicon Valley. Like that conversation of like, okay, like, let's think hard, right, about, what's in the lab today. And by the way, look, what's in the lab today, who knows which of those things are going to work? Okay, they're in the lab today. We have to assign some probability that they're going to work. Let's just make a list of whatever, let's make a list of the 20 things. Let's figure they're all 50-50. Okay, then let's just allocate effort over the next decade to try to figure out how to get in front of these things. To me, that's the productive thing to do.
Mark, we touched on something a little earlier. I just want to maybe circle back to, and that's, some of the challenges that I know you've seen that you sort of referred to are these seemingly impenetrable barriers that leading edge tech startups, small companies have to gain traction with the U.S. government. And, we've heard all those. And we just talked about how important it is to maintain our edge on national security. So something seems like, this can't keep going on the way it is. Something has to change. Are there a few concrete things that you can think of that, on either side, the government side or the business side, that would have to change to try to make this a more well-trodden path, as opposed to what a lot of these companies describe as this adventure in the wilderness, trying to figure out how to deal with this behemoth?
Yeah, so to be clear, this is a lot what we do in our day job, and a lot of our work in American Dynamism is to help our companies navigate through this. And companies do get through it, right? Like it is a possible thing to do, and we fund companies that are going to go on that journey that you just described, of trying to figure out how to kind of decode the government as a customer and try to fight, the Beltway bandits, the incumbents, and so forth. Like so we look, it is a possible thing. It is very difficult. It is much harder to do that than just like launching a company that sells things to consumers or to businesses. But it can be done. Look, a lot of the barriers that are in place today were put in place for what at the time I think were believed to be good reasons. A lot of what we deal with today is the result of the procurement reforms of the 1970s and 1980s, which was an attempt to kind of professionalize and reduce corruption, in especially defense procurement kind of during that era, to kind of formalize and systematize procurement. I just think in practice that all went too far, and it ended up being co-opted by incumbent entrenched interests and being used to prevent startup competition. There are, I would say, more and more programs that are emerging over time where people are figuring out how to have, buckets of money for experiments. There's a lot of sort of pockets of money inside DoD, for example. They're not large amounts of money, but like they're pockets of money that a new startup can go get $1 million contract, if they figure out how to get to the right person. There's systems integrators that we work with that specialize in that. We work a lot on that. Some of the intelligence agencies are very forward looking on these things, and they'll move more quickly. And so I guess, a big part of it is just more of that, and then, look, the more outreach, the better. The more outreach from DC, the better. And the more people who are in senior positions over time at these agencies, are very interested in this, it'd be better. And a lot of that happens. Like a lot of that's been happening. And there's, a lot of people inside these places that we work with and that we know and are very, very helpful in that process. And so I think that's part of it. And then again, I would put at least as much responsibility here on the industry, right? Like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has, Silicon Valley at a base level, like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs have to decide, number one, are they patriotic? Right? Like, and then like, are they mission aligned? And do they want to contribute to, for example, national security? And then if they do, like, okay, how are they going to build their company where they're going to be competent at doing that? And what kind of talent do they need to bring in, right? And maybe they need to prioritize the government as a customer, faster, and try to, bring in the kinds of people who know how to sell to the government and work with the government. And maybe they just have to take, for example, policy issues more seriously up front, and build some kind of lobbying capability so they can go toe to toe with people trying to block them out. And so I think it's at least as much our responsibility. And then, you've heard me describe, I think the aspirational thing, the ideal thing would be, like, my experience is basically trust either spirals up or down, right? Like, right. Generally over time, when you're working with somebody and it's a complex situation, you're either gaining trust or losing trust. And if you're losing trust, it's really hard. It's a spiral, and it feeds on itself, and it things degenerate, and it becomes very hard to ever rebuild it. And that's very bad. On the other hand, look, a lot of our more, all of us have had productive relationships with people over time. And the ideal relationship is one where you're gaining trust. And the more time that passes, the more each side knows that they're trying to optimize for the other person, and that they're trying to actually have good things happen. And so I think what you want to get into is an upward spiral of trust. Like I said, I think mainly like at a macro level, it's been a downward spiral for 30 years. But there are bright spots, and there are areas in which there's an upward spiral. And I think we should try to for sure like fix the downward spirals, but we should also just encourage the upward spirals, and encourage the relationship building, and encourage the process of goodwill and people understanding shared mission. And I think some of that is happening also.
So, Mark, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a crystal ball thing here. So, at a high level, you once said that software was the 21st century's new steel. And so, here's where I sort of maybe get your views here. Do you feel we're entering a new sort of golden age of digital infrastructure and technological advances that sort of dramatically improve life and, the very bright future scenario? Or both of these, I guess, could coexist, or a more dystopian view, because you've also said AI will improve warfare. Now, that leads people to the more frightening, the conjures up visions of the Matrix, Skynet, all that stuff on the far end. So, where are we here? And on the AI part, what's a rational way to think about AI for the future, not primarily for national security, but also, more broadly?
Yeah. So look, a couple things about new technology. So look, new technology is not, it's these are tools. Like technology fundamentally is building tools. And then we as individuals and societies decide how to use those tools. And look, the history of tools is they tend to be dual use, right, as they say, right? And so like the shovel can be used to dig a well or like bash somebody over the head, right? Like and it's been like this from the very beginning. It's been like this with fire. It's been like this with bow and arrow can be used to provide meat for your family or to kill the enemy tribe. It's always like this. And so there's always a good and a bad. The overall historical arc has been that overwhelmingly we as a civilization have benefited from it. We none of us today would want to trade places with people who had inferior levels of technology 100 or 300 or 1,000 years ago. The world is much better today. By the way, it's more peaceful. By the way, it's less violent. It's we're a lot more physically comfortable. Our children are more likely to survive. It's just like everything, just the material circumstances of humanity are far superior today as a consequence of technology. There's been a lot of, war and conflict and strife and death along the way. And, the mechanization of warfare, really changed things. And then, of course, the risk of, the risk of nuclear destruction, really changed things. So there is always this, this sort of dialectic or dichotomy, between the two. I'm very optimistic. I'll just take AI as an example. I think AI, the positive view on AI is just like, look, every kid from here on out is going to have a super genius AI tutor friend, that is going to teach her, that is going to help them learn and understand everything that they ever want to learn and understand. And I have an 8-year-old. I see this with my 8-year-old. I hook him up with ChatGPT, and like he has a question on something, and his teacher doesn't know, or I'm not available, and he's able to instantly learn whatever he wants. And that's just like an absolutely remarkable educational, breakthrough opportunity. Healthcare, look, AI medicine is going to be much better. Even just ChatGPT today, like it's not allowed to give medical advice, but it turns out it's actually like a really, really good doctor. And you hear more and more stories all the time of people who have had chronic conditions. They've never quite gotten to the right specialist. They plug it into even just ChatGPT and they actually get diagnosed properly for the first time. So like everybody's going to have a super genius AI doctor, right? And so you're going to have these like huge step function increases in quality of life, coming out of this. And then, look, it's going to, I think AI is going to absolutely transform warfare. We talked about that. When I say things like it's going to improve warfare, right, it freaks people out, but I really think it shouldn't. And the reason is because, I didn't serve in the military, so I don't have direct experience with this, but from everything I've read and everybody I've talked to, war between human beings is just absolutely horrible. And you've got soldiers at risk, which is a huge problem. And then you've got, the fog of war, people not knowing what's going on. You've got blue on blue, collateral, sort of friendly fire. You've got mass civilian, every war in the past, mass civilian casualties, right? Even when you don't want to, you do. And so it's just been this, just like, especially in the last century, this just like incredibly, incredibly brutal thing. And then everybody's just like, information is hard to come by, so everybody's confused. The planners are confused, the strategists are confused, the tacticians are confused, the unit, leaders are confused. Very little, this so-called, concept of battlefield intelligence, very little awareness of what's happening around you. Who are you targeting? Are you hitting the right person? And so, like, everything I just described, in theory, you can now really improve, right? And so you can have, military assets that don't put soldiers' lives at risk. You can have much, broader information awareness of what's happening strategically, what's happening in the battlefield. You can have, every planner and commander should be able to have, AI augmented, basically battlefield support systems that basically help them understand what's happening, help them make good decisions. Usually, like I said, you should be able to do much more directed strikes that, with much less collateral damage than in the past. Like, it may be that the result of this is just like much less death. Just like flat out much less death, right? And like, that would be like a giant, it's almost inconceivable to, there's something in how people think about this where they have a hard time envisioning that, but it's like, wow, like actually that would be pretty great, right? Historians would look back on that and say, wow, that was a tremendous like moral advance. And I think that's a real possibility, and I think we should be open to that as a real form of upside.
So, Mark, let me just ask you one last question. We have a fair number of college students, both undergrads and graduate students, that listen to Intelligence Matters. So, if you could give one or two pieces of advice for them as they enter this 21st century technological workplace, what would that be?
Yeah, so Douglas Adams is the science fiction author who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which a lot of people love. And he had this famous thing that he said about new technologies. He said they're generational in nature. He said at any point in history, any new technology is received the following ways by three different groups of people. If you're 35 or above, the new technology is unholy and against the natural order of things and will inevitably lead to the collapse and destruction of society, right? If you're between 15 and 35, you're like, wow, this new thing is nifty and cool, and I might be able to make a career out of it. And if you're below the age of 15, you're like, well, this is just obvious. This is how the world always worked, right?
That's
right?
great.
Right, exactly, right?
Right.
And you see this over and over again, right?
Yeah.
And so look, for the people you're talking about, they're in that second bucket. And so everything that we're describing, I think these are the technologies of the future. These are the professions of and disciplines of the future. These are the things that are really going to matter. And these are going to be the ways that, this new generation of people, are going to be able to have huge impact. And look, they're going to ultimately be the people who decide, right, how this gets made. People our age are going to, have a voice here for a while. But it's really a new generation of people that are going to build, the systems of the future and the organizations of the future, and the doctrines and everything that follows from that. And they're going to do that, and then they're going to be running it all, in 30 years. And so, this I think is their time, to basically step up and take a leadership position. And like when technology changes fast, that is a particular opportunity for young people to really kind of punch in and play an important role in the world, maybe faster than would otherwise be the case. And I would certainly encourage anybody, of that age listening to this to really lean in hard on these new things.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. That was Marc Andreessen. I'm Andy McCreadis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.